Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the BDC Presents webinar for February. My name is Becky Menton. I'm a senior regulatory and policy specialist who normally can talk much better than this here on the California team at BDC. I'm really excited that we have such an amazing panel today to talk about one of the most important issues facing many in America today, which is the affordability of electricity. And some of the different pathways and solutions that folks have considered to actually tackle this problem. Next slide, please. We have a pretty rigorous set of panelists today, so we're really just diving right in. So apologies if you were just joining and got thrown into it. A little bit about the Building Decarbonization Coalition. Building Decarbonization Coalition really harnesses the power of the coalition to forge paths to upgrade and power homes and buildings with clean electricity. We align people, policymakers, workers, building industry stakeholders, and environmental groups at every level to join in building decarbonization and build a sustainable future. So if this is the first time that you're here, welcome. Otherwise, welcome back. Next slide, please. Thank you. A moment to comment on our Trailblazer members. We really appreciate the Trailblazer members. It's the support these Trailblazer members offer through annual donations to the Building Decarbonization Coalition that allows us to continue offering webinars, reports, and other resources free to anybody who wants to participate or take advantage of them. So really just a moment to thank everybody for bringing us here. We have a few more upcoming events. If you enjoy this webinar moderated by me, then come on back March 19th to hear our policy call. Every month, I help lead a call talking about what's happening in policy for building decarbonizations here in California. We will be announcing our next BDC Presents via our newsletter next week. So if you are subscribed to our newsletter, you'll get the early word about what that exciting presentation will be, but it's always something good. And then, of course, we have a New York Thermal Energy Network Summit that's coming up March 6th, 8:30 a.m. in person. And there's a lot of really exciting stuff happening with thermal energy networks on the East Coast, particularly in New York City. So it's a good opportunity to dive in. A few logistics that I just wanted to make sure to cover. We have everyone muted. Please stay muted. If you have questions for the panelists, please drop those in the Q&A feature. We'll be tracking the Q&A feature and polling questions that we can ask at the end of the presentations. If you have comments for the whole group, please feel free to drop them in the chat. We are recording the webinar. We place all the recordings of our webinars in our resource library so that you can see all the amazing BDC Presents from past as well. And then everybody who registered for this webinar will be emailed a link and any additional resources next week. So now I get the chance to introduce the panelists who have graciously agreed to share some of their time with us today. We'll be hearing first from a couple of folks from the Brattle group. Dr. Sanem Sergici is a principal in the Brattle group's Boston, Massachusetts office, specializing in innovative retail rate design and economic analysis of distributed energy resources. And Mr. Akhilesh Ramakrishnan is a managing energy associate at the Brattle Group and specializes in policy analysis and planning related to electrification and distributed energy resources. So they'll be sharing some findings from a report that they've been digging into around different tools and levers for rate reform. We'll next be moving to the state of Illinois. Sarah Moskowitz is the executive director of the Citizens Utility Board, an Illinois group that advocates for consumer protections, lower utility bills, and equitable consumer-friendly climate solutions in Springfield at the Illinois Commerce Commission and in the courts. And then we'll be coming back to California to hear about a proposal that folks at the California Environmental Justice Alliance have put before the California Public Utilities Commission for rate reform and affordability here in California. Alexis Sutterman is one of the energy justice managers at the California Environmental Justice Alliance. She supports community-led and people-powered campaigns toward a regenerative and just energy economy. And then we'll also be hearing from Theo Caretto, an associate attorney with Communities for a Better Environment, a member of the California Environmental Justice Alliance. Theo's work supports Wilmington communities, and CBE focuses on California energy regulatory policy, hydrogen and gas-fired power plant retirement. So really a wonderful group of folks, and I'll hand it over to our friends at the Brattle Group to start.
Great, thank you so much, Becky. The next slide, please. So it's our pleasure to be here today and to talk about one of our most favorite subjects, which is the role of rates in accelerating decarbonization in an affordable way. So we're going to be talking about a paper that we wrote for Electric Systems Integration Group discussing the role of rates in improving the economics of heat pump adoption. But before we go to that, I just want to highlight sort of this chart that comes from another report that we have done that really highlights the importance of customer-led action on decarbonization. So, in this chart, what we have found is that, we can, if we focus on greening the grid, mostly through supply side renewable adoption, we will achieve decarbonization. And we found that by just greening the grid on the supply side, we can reduce at a national level the 2040 emissions by 284 million metric tons, again, under the existing ambitious goals and targets. And then what we've done is, okay, so now let's look at the entire United States, and let's look at just the residential sector and light duty vehicle part of the transportation sector. And now assume that what happens if we can really adopt all these greenhouse gas reducing technologies in these sectors, just installing a lot of behind the meter solar and investing in energy efficiency for both gas and electric, replacing all the fossil fuel heating systems with air source heat pumps and ground source heat pumps. Similarly, for water heating, switching them over to electric water heating, what would we see? And we found something really interesting. We found that if we can pursue this customer-led actions really aggressively and ambitiously, so we can reduce the 2040 emissions by 534 million metric tons, which means that we're effectively doubling the yield in emission savings that we get from just greening the grid by twice. And this 534 million metric tons of savings amount to retiring 135 coal plants by 2040. So again, this is all to say that the things that we do on the customer side are tremendously important. And oftentimes rates are a gateway to achieve most of these things that I just discussed, because customers need to make sure that their investments pay back and they achieve operational savings by installing new, heat pumps or other appliances in their homes. So the next slide, please. Let's just talk about, specifically heat pumps here. We have done this analysis for other technologies as well, but, for today, our focus on the heat pump economics. As you may know, heat pump economics are not great for everyone yet. They represent a centerpiece in many decarbonization plans. Building electrification is very key, but currently heat pump installation costs are typically higher than gas furnaces and boilers, and that their operating costs, even though they vary by region, they also tend to be higher than operating costs for gas furnaces and boilers. So that is a non-starter. Like if operating a heat pump is more expensive than operating a gas furnace, there's just very little incentive for customers to adopt these technologies. So, and to make things worse, there is really a scarcity of rate options out there that might really help with sort of improving economics of these heat pumps and these technologies. And when we say the rate options, I want to make sure everybody understands that I'm not talking about subsidized rates. I'm not talking about rates that are subsidized for the heat pump customers. I'm talking about rate options that are still cost-based, that still recover the right amount of revenue requirements, but they have different designs, different structures, such that they align with the operating characteristics of heat pumps, such as enabling high load factors and having flexibility for seasonal usages and things like that, which my colleague Akhilesh Ramakrishnan is going to be talking about. So as we are on the topic of rates, if you could move to the next slide, I just also want to highlight that the primary mission of retail pricing is to recover utilities revenue requirement in the most efficient and equitable fashion. So we often talk about efficient price signals to encourage optimal consumption, to lead to bill stability, but at the same time, these rates should be understandable by the customers. So when we use rates to achieve so many other objectives, then they oftentimes fail on their primary mission and they start under incentivizing or over incentivizing wrong technologies, or they lead to cost shifts among customer groups. So that's a very slippery slope. So that's why, again, I want to emphasize that, here our focus is on maintaining cost reflectivity, finding alternative rates that are still cost-based, but could be favorable for heat pump operating characteristics. And we have found some rates that do that and have developed a study essentially that show the impacts of those rates on customer operating characteristics of these heat pumps. The next slide, please. So not really going to go through the details of these rates that are presented here. The whole point here is that in most places in the United States still, the prevalent rate design is a flat volumetric rate design in which customers are charged the same price across the year. That has served its purpose, and now we are in a different environment with decarbonization and all kinds of different needs. We also have AMI. So we have a lot of AMI being advanced metering infrastructure and smart meters. So we have much advanced capabilities for being able to implement different rate designs that can vary by time, that can measure demand. So just again, we have a lot of options out there that could be offered to the customers, and some of these customers might be really favorable for heat pump customers. Let me turn it over to my colleague Akhilesh so that he can talk about our work quantifying some of these impacts.
Thanks, Sanem. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about the work that we did for a northeastern utility, which is in a state with one of the most ambitious decarbonization goals in the U.S. They're trying to get to net zero economy-wide by 2050, and the state is kind of fully behind going all in on electrification as soon as possible to start decarbonizing the building sector. And so what this utility reached out to us for was to look at some of their actual customer data and look at both how they use gas for heating and what would happen when these customers participate in some of their heat pump programs, kind of use the incentives that the utility is providing, adopt the heat pump, and kind of what are their bills going to look like after they adopt the heat pump. So what we helped them do was we looked at their existing gas customers and tried to figure out how much they actually spend on heating today. And if they were to move that amount of heating load over to a heat pump instead, how would that change their electricity usage? And ultimately, how would that impact their electricity bill and total energy bill? So to help us do that, we defined this metric that we're calling the operating cost gap. And that sounds pretty simple in theory. It's basically the gap between how much you pay for heating today on your gas bill and how much you pay for heating tomorrow on your electric bill when you adopt the heat pump. But that is in practice pretty hard even for us to quantify, and definitely probably too hard for any customer to quantify, especially with kind of how complex electric rates can get. So that's where this kind of illustrative chart that's on the slide comes in. We put this together kind of just to keep track of the different moving parts from on the left, when the customer doesn't have a heat pump yet, that's pre-electrification. And the bar on the right is the post-electrification. And you can see that we're considering a customer who is still using gas for other uses. That could be cooking, drying, whatever else the customer is using gas for. There's that second part, which is all customers are already electric customers. We're assuming that kind of their electric usage for all of their other uses remains pretty similar from pre-electrification to post-electrification. And then there's the part that actually changes, how much they're paying for heating. So the operating cost gap that we're looking at here is just that difference in the heating, but kind of keeping in mind that any changes that we make to make that better could affect the other components as well. So next slide. And so we looked at 4 different rate designs that this utility already has available. And what we found was that with their current default rate design, which is primarily volumetric, like most utility rates, the operating cost gap is positive. So what that means is electric heating costs more than gas heating by about $300. That's that $24.44 versus $27.15. But the real important finding here was switching to any of the other rates, which, remember, as Sanem mentioned, are cost reflective. So they don't include any subsidies. They're just rates that reflect real costs, but with different components like demand charges or higher fixed charges or time varying rates. We found that switching to any of those and kind of treating the heat pump based on when it's used reduces how much these customers are paying for heating, and it flips the operating cost gap negative. So providing customers these options and having them choose the one that would be more beneficial for them would be really helpful for customers who are adopting heat pumps. Next slide. So, kind of a natural question to ask at this point is, if customers can just choose the rate that's beneficial for them and reduce their bill, how is that still cost reflective? So what we're looking at with these rates is different components that are more cost reflective in the sense they break out the rates more granularly. So for example, the time varying volumetric rate and the demand charge based rates have a component that is seasonal. And so their summer and winter rate levels are different. And the winter one is lower because this utility is summer peaking. Similarly, for the kind of diurnal pattern or change within the day, they have a lower rate for off-peak usage, which is like from midnight to 7 a.m., and then a higher rate during the day when loads are usually higher. So kind of reflecting these granularity of causation within the rates and kind of overlaying that with when the heat pump is actually used shows that just based on heating load characteristics, like you need more heat at night, you obviously need heat in the winter, not in the summer. Reflecting those in the customer's bill is cost reflective, and it leads to them paying less than they would under default rates. Next slide. Yeah, so just to recap, so what we've found is that providing customers these other alternative, more cost reflective rate options can really help heat pump customers by reducing how much they're paying for their heating. One really important thing to keep in mind when offering these rates is that offering a customer a different rate could also mean changes to their the other portion of their bills, not just heating. So, some customers might have characteristics where they have a peaky load, or they use electricity kind of at the more expensive parts of the day. So that could lead to, certain specific customers having different results. So one of the important things utilities need to focus on is kind of who to market these rates to and which rates to recommend to different types of customers. That's something they'll have to figure out for kind of specifically their customer base and different types of customers. So yeah, that's about it. I'll, recommend everyone read the e-cig paper that's linked in the chat, and pass it on to the next presenter.
All right, thank you, Sarah. Take us away.
Thanks for that. That was fascinating, and we could use analysis of that sort in Illinois. We've done a lot with electric rates in Illinois, but looking at them from the filter of incentivizing home electrification is yet to be done. But we do have some options here in Illinois. So next slide. Again, my name's Sarah Moskowitz. I'm Executive Director of Illinois CUB. We are a consumer advocacy organization that was created in the early 80s to represent utility customers. We're not a part of state government. We're completely standalone, but we do have standing to get involved at the Illinois Commerce Commission on behalf of residential and small business utility customers. We also do a lot of on-the-ground grassroots education and advocacy, and we man a hotline. So we hear from people who are unhappy or who have questions about things. We've done a bit of research using anonymized AMI data that's available here in Illinois. And let's go on to the next slide. So Illinois, we have benefited a lot from a series of forward-thinking laws, especially most recently CEJA, which we're still implementing, and before that, the Future Energy Jobs Act. We are a restructured state, meaning that our electric utilities do not own generation, and we do have AMI pretty much statewide. 2011 law allowed for utilities to make those investments. So we were we might have been the first state to have residential real-time pricing available to residential customers pretty much statewide. But the most recent bill that you talk to anybody in this space in Illinois, they're always talking about CEJA these days, and we still are. It passed, over 2 years ago, but it's still front of mind, although we are looking forward to the next round of bills to introduce to build on that, maybe a CEJA for gas, some power sector legislation that might start looking more at storage. But CEJA did a lot. It set up some beneficial electrification programs that the utilities now have to run, although the first round of those were more about electric vehicles and not as much about building electrification as we would have liked. The door is open for more building electrification through that venue. But I think I was invited today to talk about our low-income discount rate. CEJA basically created a process for the commission to start looking at that, and we're starting to see those introduced by utilities now. So let's go on to the next slide. So we do have some dynamic pricing options available to residential customers in Illinois, and my colleagues at CUB and I spend a lot of our lives explaining these to people. To recap, some of them, default residential rate, of course, flat, doesn't matter what time of day you're using your power. Commonwealth Edison has a slightly different rates for electric heat customers versus non-electric heat customers. You can see the details there. Ameren doesn't, but interestingly, Ameren, which is the Central and Southern Illinois electric utility, they have a per kilowatt hour volumetric rate for the first kilowatt hour, 800 kilowatt hours that you use. But if you use more than that, your price goes down a little bit. Both ComEd and Ameren Illinois offer a residential real-time pricing product. So that's something that we like to encourage for folks, especially people who don't use a ton of air conditioning, or people who have electric vehicles, or people who have electric heat right now, because we do not have that many peaks in the winter, because Illinois is predominantly heated with natural gas or fossil gas. And then there have been some limited time of use products. ComEd has their time of day pilot. Ameren has an electric vehicle rate, which is kind of depending on how you look at it, a sophisticated or complicated time of use rate. And then, of course, we're a restructured state, so we have residential retail choice, for better or for worse, whole other can of worms. And some of those from over the years have offered time of use rates. I am not under the impression that many people have taken advantage of those, but I want to mention that they could be offering more of those, and they're not. Next slide. So we in Illinois have a framework for sharing anonymized interval usage data from the utilities. So ComEd and Ameren, you can apply to them to get access to interval usage data following a 15-15 rule that I won't get into, but is basically designed to preserve the anonymity of the people whose data are being shared. And some folks have taken advantage of this, not as much as I would have liked, but it's a real treasure trove of information about how people use their energy. We ran a study a few years ago that basically we applied a cluster analysis to the data and used that to expose 6 unique residential ComEd customer load profiles. And when we checked those load profiles by the zip code data against the demographics of those zip codes, basically we found what we'd suspected was that people who live in lower and moderate income areas tend to be paying more than their fair share for capacity than the folks who live in more suburban areas with bigger properties and peakier usage. So, the data access is really key. If you don't have like a data access framework in your state, that would be something to kind of work towards, because that can help with these kinds of analyses to both kind of identify the problem, but also start to compose kind of some solutions and maybe some more equitable rates, and rates that can kind of incentivize what we want people to do. Next slide. Yeah, so CEJA did a lot. Like I mentioned, it created a process for regulators to consider new low-income discount rates. There were a series of workshops. You can read all about them on the ICC's website. The commission staff made a report to the Illinois General Assembly. Also, CEJA codified something that came out of COVID. There was a COVID stipulated agreement in which the utilities agreed to submit arrearage data to regulators on the regular, and now they have to do that per law, which is also really helpful for us. Next slide. And I couldn't resist showing you that data, just so this is great. In addition to that anonymized AMI data, this is really great. This is basically by zip code. Every regulated utility in Illinois has to submit every month how many people in that zip code are behind on their bills, were charged late fees, were disconnected, got disconnect notices, how much money they owe. It is really, really helpful stuff, and fascinating, and unfortunately heartbreaking. You can really see which communities have been hit the hardest by energy burden, the affordability crisis, especially here in Chicago, with gas rates right now. There are things missing from these reports. I would love to see maybe average usage for these zip codes per month. I would love to see how many people use that utility for heat versus non-heat. There's stuff in there that would also be really useful, especially when looking at how we can design for the transition. But it's a good start, and folks can always access that at the ICC's website. Next slide. I'm probably going too long here. So People's Gas in Chicago, those bills are crazy. And if you want to talk about rate designs that encourage electrification, I know that the folks at Brattle were talking about how the payoff isn't there in a lot of jurisdictions to justify making the switch on like a cost basis for the consumer. But in Chicago, in fact, the payoff is quicker than maybe in some other areas, simply because, unfortunately, our gas utilities rates are through the roof. And these are recent stats here about how hard hit a lot of communities are. Next slide. So all of the major utilities came in for rate increases last year. And in the natural gas rate case final orders, the Illinois Commerce Commission approved a tiered low-income discount rate. And this is the first time we've had a discount rate in Illinois. We don't have it yet. It's supposed to be in place by this October in time for the heating season. And it's going to cover a lot of people. 5 tiers going up to 3 times federal poverty level. Now that discount's going to be really small, the highest tier, 5% off your bill. But depending on which gas utility serves you, your discount could be up to 83%. It's interesting because the percentage differs according to which utility is. So it'll be interesting having to explain that different level of discount to people who don't live in people's gas territory versus, so there are some wrinkles. We'll see how it hammers out. There's another wrinkle is that the approved discount rates will apply to the whole bill, which I think a lot of you will understand. The gas utilities don't set the rate for the gas supply. So that's not regulated, and the recovery for the costs of this program, this discount, will be a separate line item on everybody's bills. And I'm not sure what they're going to label that line item as. That'll be interesting to see. But we're a little concerned about what happens when, unfortunately, like gas prices spike again. Suddenly, that line item covering the cost of the discount will spike. And of course, when you're thinking about rate design that encourages electrification, this is it. So this forces you to realize that there's kind of like a timeline, a time aspect of this too. People in Chicago and across the state are suffering, and they need immediate relief. However, so you have to balance that against kind of the right, I guess, like economic signals to make the switch. And so the issue of equity is going to be a sticky one. And this is something that, everybody has on their list of problems to solve in this transition, but we haven't solved it yet. And I know I'm running out of time. Next slide. Okay, yeah, this might be my last slide. So there's a lot going on. It's been kind of scattershot, but a lot of the folks working in all of these processes are the same folks. So there's at least some continuity there. We don't have electric low-income discount rates yet. The electric utilities are going to be proposing those this year. ComEd has indicated to us that theirs is going to be modeled after the gas low-income discount rates, although they're going to have real issues applying it to the whole bill. We'll see how that pans out. There's a triennial electric utility rate design docket that's usually kind of humdrum, but we hope that this go around, it might be a good opportunity to look some more at rate designs that could incentivize electrification while not leaving those who can't afford to electrify first in the lurch. There's a lot of other things in the mix. And so if you're interested in paying attention to what's happening in Illinois, it's very interesting. But yeah, we need to really look more at the rate design aspect for incentivizing electrification. Next slide. And I think that was my last real one. Yeah.
Thank you. And before we turn it over to our friends at CEJA to bring us home, just a reminder to drop any questions that you have for our panelists in the Q&A. We'll be gathering those, and I'll be posing them live at the conclusion of the presentation. Thanks, Alexis. Feel free to take us away.
Yeah, sounds good. Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Already hearing such great ideas and information from the previous presenters, making me inspired for our work here. We can go on to the next slide. Yeah, first I wanted to share that CEJA. So CEJA is not CEJA. I already heard some crossover there with the last bill that was being described, or law. CEJA is actually the California Environmental Justice Alliance, and the J is like an H sound because we have a lot of Spanish-speaking populations in our base. We're a statewide community-led alliance working to achieve environmental justice and build green, healthy, sustainable communities in California. We unite the powerful local organizing of our members in low-income communities and communities of color who are the most impacted by environmental hazards to advance policy solutions that alleviate poverty and pollution. So you can see our members right there on that map that make up our alliance. And I'll highlight Communities for a Better Environment in there, which you'll hear my colleague present who works at that specific organization. We can go on to the next slide. So I wanted to start out by just sharing that CEJA's work as an environmental justice alliance is really rooted in the vision for a just transition from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy. So this not only means shifting from dirty to clean energy, but also really transforming extractive practices that have hurt our communities and the environment and really move towards an economy of life that values community, care, and cooperation. So for our energy program at CEJA, this has meant really pursuing community-led solutions that advance energy democracy, alleviates energy insecurity and energy poverty, and reduces energy burden. Next slide, please. So with that context, really wanted to talk to you today about energy affordability in California. So it's clear that in our state, as it looks like possibly in other states as well, we're really facing a major utility bill affordability crisis. In the past few years in California, residential rates have spiked 63% for PG&E, 52% for SoCal Edison, and 13% for SDG&E. So you can see that this trend is just continuing to increase, and we expect even more rates to spike in the coming years. We're looking at a situation in which 1 in 5 households right now that are served by these 3 largest investor-owned utilities are actually behind on their bills and experiencing a lot of insecure and unstable conditions, having to make really, unsafe and unhealthy choices around foregoing power for rent or to pay for needed power to keep themselves healthy and safe. And so we're really, really looking at something that's pretty dire for a lot of our low-income households. Next slide, please. So wanted to just kind of ground us that, from CEJA's perspective, a lead driver of this crisis is really the failure of our state to be holding our utilities accountable and really planning for a transition to clean energy that's prioritizing our community's well-being over profits. So that's actually leading to the revenue base itself, the pie, if you will, is growing and growing to a point where, we think it's unjust. Next slide. So in addition to that element of, wanting to make sure we're not investing in harmful things that are growing the pie exponentially, our rate system is also extremely regressive. We see that millionaires and low-income customers can pay around the same rates to access electricity, which to us, is unacceptable given people are coming at their energy bills at, very drastically different income levels, and therefore have particular vulnerabilities when it comes to paying their energy bills. We also know that low-income customers are already struggling to make ends meet, and they're less able to do things like move or, change their energy patterns or pay for efficiency upgrades and kind of like do things that could save them money because they're already, more vulnerable to different elements of their life. So we really need to make sure that we are taking these particular vulnerabilities into account. Next slide. So therefore, we know that California needs to really do a lot of work in this area. We need to pursue solutions that, shrink the pie or at least don't allow it to continue growing at the expense of our communities. In addition to that, we need to think about more equitably dividing up the pie, dividing up the costs of maintaining the electricity system in a way that actually aligns with our progressive values as a state. Next slide. So recognizing that we're in a pretty dire situation, we did see some action in 2022 from our lawmakers that passed Assembly Bill 205. This required the California Public Utilities Commission to implement income graduated fixed charges that could protect low-income customers and lower their bills. So if we're taking, the framing that I used from the prior slide, this is a important tool that could help more equitably divide up the pie, so that low-income customers are protected from upcoming rate hikes. I'll pass it on to Theo to present about more of the details of these charges now.
Yeah, so just to get into a little bit of history in California, I know some of the other presenters talked about fixed charges and different billing schemes. Prior to the passage of this bill in 2022, income graduate or fixed charges on electrical utility bills were capped in California to $10 and $5 for low-income customers. And were explored in a couple of minor ways, but weren't really like a major way in which utilities or utility advocates were thinking about changing how energy is billed. And Assembly Bill 205 really changed that. Not only did it do away with those caps on fixed charges, but it also instructed our public utility regulator, the Public Utilities Commission, to implement a series of fixed charges that were based on income. And there are a couple of different constraints around the fixed charges. They're only allowed to encapsulate fixed costs of the utility grid. But the goal of them is to move any fixed costs that don't vary with electricity usage out of volumetric rate and into fixed costs, in order to create a strata of how those fixed grid costs are recovered from ratepayers, recovering more of those fixed costs from high-income ratepayers and smaller chunks of those fixed costs from low-income ratepayers. And the idea is that this benefits low-income ratepayers in two ways. It helps them, it makes it so that they're no longer required to put like front costs to pay for significant fixed pieces of the electrical grid in order to just access volumetric electricity. And it does so by pushing those costs onto high-income customers and making that volumetric rate lower, so that low-income customers, which, as Alexis mentioned, almost now a quarter of customers in California are in arrears. So these customers who are having difficulty paying their really high rates are able to do so a little more easily. Next slide, please. And so to that end, we landed in this space where the California utility regulator is instructed to implement fixed charges that are income graduated, but doesn't have a great deal of direction on how exactly to do that. And so it has resulted in a long and contentious regulatory process by which a number of different parties, including our three large investor-owned utilities, ratepayer advocates, the solar industry, and environmental groups like CEJA, are vying for different outcomes. The outcome that CEJA is vying for is one that truly restructures the way that electricity bills are sent to customers in California in a way that has true economic progressivity and recognizes the actual economic situation in California and the economic realities of many families in California. 55% of California families are renters, and so have less ability to manage their bills in a number of ways. And the federal poverty level, which is the limit for certain low-income programs in California, doesn't really reflect the true economic reality for folks who live in urban centers or other areas where the cost of living is higher. And so to develop a fixed charge proposal that introduces rate progressivity and benefits low-income customers, we proposed a 5-tier structure that essentially limits the fixed charges that anybody who makes between 0 and 80% of the area median income in their county pays no fixed charge and graduates fixed charges up from there so that the majority of costs that are fixed on the electricity grid are billed to customers who make very, very high income, of which we have many in California. The full strata of incomes is here on the screen. It differentiates customers into 80% AMI, or 0 to 80% AMI, 80% AMI to $200,000, 200,000 to 500,000, 500 to 2 million, and 2 million and above. The 80% definition is a definition that's found in California law. It's also recognized by federal law, and it's this standard that is used in many housing spaces to define low income. And this proposal that SE has put together would result in bill savings, not just for low income customers in that first income tier, but also customers who are in that 80% to 200 income tier. Next slide. And the rationale for this proposal is based on some really great intent language that we got in the bill. It's not statutory language, but this is legislative intent language that was passed alongside Assembly Bill 205, which instructs the commission to establish fixed charges, which equitably allocate and recover costs among residential customers, and also instructs them to seek to more fairly distribute the burden of the electricity system. And so that's sort of what we had in mind when we were creating this proposal. Next slide, please. But going forward, the details really matter. There's a great deal of contention in this proposal, and SEHA's proposal is one of many. Most of the other proposals before the Regulatory Commission do not incorporate nearly as much protection for low-income customers, and many don't provide bill savings for any customers who make above $50,000 a year, which in California is extremely low income in most areas. So we're in this place where we need to really focus on the details, focus on understanding what it means to be low income in California, and that there is an opportunity here to reach economic progressivity for a great deal of our electricity bills.
Thank you to all of our panelists. I feel like I just attended a master's seminar in rates and affordability, and that was really wonderful. I'm going to kick us off with one question, and then we'll start going to all the questions coming into the chat. This is for all the panelists, so feel free to take this one at a time. One of the questions that we are grappling with in California that I know is happening elsewhere is the role of subsidy in rates. We know that we need to use our subsidies to help pay for climate programs and some of these rate discount mechanisms, but they also create a pressure on rates. So I'm curious if there are solutions or thoughts around how to balance that need to invest against the need to keep rates affordable and have price signals that match the policies we're trying to achieve. And anyone can feel free to address that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very difficult question, Becky, obviously, and everybody's trying to sort of become creative and come up with a solution. Can you hear me? Can you hear me all right?
You're fading a little bit. I'm sorry.
How about now? No? I wonder what's going on. Let me turn off my...
I think you might be covering your mic with your hands, maybe.
No, how is it now? Is it better?
Good. Better, yeah.
Maybe it was bandwidth. No, I think all I want to say is I personally think that the better way to help lower income customers is to provide programs and bill assistance type of programs instead of creating discount rates. I really worry about doing this through the rate structure, because whenever we integrate a subsidy to the rates, we are drastically changing the efficiency of those price signals, and it will have really big and long-lived consequences because in some jurisdictions, these LMI populations are up to 50% of the entire residential customer base. So, and then that could provide, perverse incentives for low-income customers just to overuse or not getting interested in conservation. So in my opinion, the better way to do this is through providing bill assistance through bill discounts instead of rate discounts. And there's this idea of personalized income programs in which you essentially target an energy burden level for each individual customer, and you cap their bills at that level so that their energy burden never exceeds, let's say, 6%. I like that idea much better. I mean, there are obviously a lot of implementation issues about figuring out each customer's income level and which organization is going to keep this data and things like that, but that they are all surmountable. So just a few ideas.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sergici. Those are really good points, and there are things that we struggle with here in Illinois as well. In Illinois, we do have a percentage of income payment program, or PIP as we call it. And it's essentially, there you have the Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program, or LIHEAP, which is a federal program administered through the states. In Illinois, we have a state supplement to that program, and that adds additional funds to the general kind of like grant LIHEAP program, but it also funds a PIP. And through the PIP, folks are basically held to a 6% of their income going towards their energy bills. And it's a great program. I was at CUB when it was first introduced and when it first passed, and I first heard about it, I thought there's no way on earth this is ever going to happen. It's just kind of a pipe dream, and here we have it. We were in the field talking to people about it when it rolled out, and it's really been kind of life-changing for folks, especially people who have been like suffering under kind of like a disconnect reconnect cycle through traditional LIHEAP every year. But the problem is it's underfunded, and it's full. In fact, they haven't even been accepting new applications for the PIP for a couple of years now in Illinois. So, and like the people who have it stick to it. So when we were going through kind of the workshop process at the low income discount rate, we were hoping to see something that was kind of modeled off of or adding to that PIP program, because it has been successful and we have the infrastructure in the state to roll it out. Like I mentioned in my presentation, this issue of kind of the immediate need versus our long-term policy goals is something that, we're going to have to balance. And I think, the low income discount rates for the gas customers in Illinois, and soon to be some form of this for electric customers, are going to be, they're going to be a big deal. Absolutely. But, I just did another presentation earlier today where I was tasked with kind of describing the utility death spiral and how that works. For the past 2 years, heat pumps have outsold gas furnaces. Because Chicago gas bills are so high, people are looking to switch. And of course, there are massive equity issues with that. The people who are switching first are the people with the means to do so out of pocket, meaning that the cost of the distribution system will be shouldered by the folks who are least able to afford it even now. So how does kind of a across the board low income discount rate kind of apply to that when the utility is only serving low income folks? So we really need to start thinking, of course, relief is needed now, no question, but we also need to be planning for the future and for some sustainable, not just rate designs, but utility business models to make sure that we can move forward.
That's great. Thank you to our panelists. We're going to go to a few questions here, and I would encourage all panelists to take a look and see if there's anything you can type an answer to in real time. We have at least one for Illinois. Going down to a few questions for the folks from CEJA. And Theo, I see that you're working on typing an answer to Nick's question, but I want to give you a chance to see if you want to address that one in real time, basically asking about the tension between rate design and conservation signals.
Yeah, I'm typing as fast as I can. This is a difficult question and one that we've been grappling with quite a bit. I think that critically in California, because rates are so high, even after we reform rates to take some of these fixed grid costs out, there's still going to be significant incentive to serve. And what the data that we're seeing shows is that the customers who are most price responsive are these low income and very low income customers who are oftentimes not using electricity that they need during heat waves, during hot summer days. And our goal here has been to address this affordability crisis to ensure that these customers who are behind on their bills, who are foregoing power, can access that power. And I mean, there's always going to be this kind of cross incentive here, but the rates are still going to be high after this proceeding, were this proceeding to adopt the proposal that we're presenting. And we are going to continue needing to address the sky high rates in California. And so those incentives to conserve are still going to be there for a majority of customers. Incenting high income customers to conserve is another issue, and kind of challenging even if rates stay at their high level.
I will also make a note that in California, our traditional conservation signals are changing rapidly. We are finding ourselves in places where we are curtailing renewable energy in the middle of the day because we don't have enough demand for it. And it really is becoming more a question of when you're saving the energy as opposed to saving energy overall if we're looking at greenhouse gas signals. So I will also build on that by noting that the ways that we've managed conservation through price signals in California are inherently evolving as well. We have a question for Sarah here. I also want to make a note, Michelle, for your question, if you can clarify in the chat which proposal you're asking about, that would be great, and then we can put that one up there as well. First, Sarah, did you say that the Illinois utilities don't generate the electricity? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, that's right. In Illinois, we are a deregulated or restructured state. So in the late 90s, essentially, our utilities were required to spin off their generation assets into separate entities. So now Commonwealth Edison is a completely separate company from Constellation Energy, which is the entity now that owns the nuclear plants that ComEd used to own. So ComEd customers are part of the PJM grid operator territory, and Ameren customers are in MISO. And so they are the actual rates for the juice itself come from these regional markets.
Wonderful. I am going to take liberties of having just one final question here. And I'm going to put this one back to CEJA, and then we can move into wrap up. How does CEJA's proposed fixed charges per income category compare to proposals by others? There's also a request to share a link to the docket. So if there's a way to answer that quickly, we'd appreciate that.
Yeah, I can answer that question, and if we don't get the docket shared, we can make sure that that's followed up. So CEJA is proposing the most progressive fixed charges. There are no parties that advocate for income brackets that are as skewed upwards as CEJA's. And most of the proposals before the commission do not reach economic progressivity. There's a proposal by Sierra Club that does. And then the next closest proposals are put forth by the NRDC and a California utility ratepayer advocate, Turn. And other proposals are quite economically regressive and would not do a great deal to protect low-income customers, but more information in the data that we can share.
And just to note, all those proposals are before the Public Utilities Commission, who will be weighing in likely this quarter with how they want to move forward, their proposal for moving forward. So nothing's set in stone in California yet. It's an active regulatory proceeding. I want to thank everyone at the top of the hour for joining us today. A reminder, we'll be sharing a recording of the presentation for anybody who is registered. You'll find out about our March by signing up for our newsletter. And tremendous thank you to all of our panelists today for sharing your expertise. This was a really wonderful information sharing session. So thanks everyone, and enjoy the rest of your Leap Day.